that's better. Okay, so I'm going to be reading This is Vegan Propaganda. This is the first session, and we're going to be doing one a week. Each session should be about 2 hours, and after each chapter, we're going to open up discussion. I've read this book before, and it's amazing. It is very well written, very well researched. It's very good. Okay. Introduction. When you read the word vegan, what are the first thoughts that come into your head? If I'd been asked that question 8 years ago, I would have told you, vegans are extremists with no sense of humour, who should mind their own business and stop forcing their views on people. Not to mention they're arrogant, self-righteous, judgmental, and militant. I would then have gone on to say, I have nothing against vegans. I just wish they would stop trying to make other people vegan and respect my personal choice to eat meat. And besides, meat tastes too good to give up. The word vegan is currently one of the most emotive there is. Love it or hate it, its ability to elicit a response cannot be denied. However, despite the word being so divisive, often very little is known about the enormous impact of animal consumption. So this is not only the book that I wish I could have given myself many years ago, when I had a strong opinion of veganism, while knowing very little about it, or people's motivations for embracing it, but it is also a comprehensive resource for vegans who want to better understand the arguments that people use against veganism and why they use them, as well as how to respond to them and become more effective advocates in the process. One sec, I have to change a setting. Right, there we go. It's no secret that veganism is growing all over the world and has become one of the most prevalent and discussed social movements of this generation. But while most of us will be aware that the primary motivations for people going vegan and adopting plant-based diets include animal rights, the environment, pandemic prevention, and personal health, often little is known about the complexity and true scale of these issues, which is exactly what this book aims to do: lay out the enormity of the injustice that is animal exploitation. Every time we eat, we have the power to radically transform the world we live in, and simultaneously contribute to addressing many of the most pressing issues that our species currently faces: climate change, infectious disease, chronic disease, human exploitation, and, of course, non-human exploitation. Every single day, our choices can help alleviate all of these problems, or they can perpetuate them. I think it's important to state that conversations about veganism and animal rights can often lead to feelings of judgment, but the purpose of this book is not to demonize people who eat meat, dairy, and eggs, or who work in the animal industries. Quite the contrary, in fact. I don't for one moment believe that they are all bad people. Good people can do bad things. Each and every one of us is a testament to that. I also believe that knowledge is power, and when we are given both sides of the story, we are then able to make informed decisions for ourselves. The problem is that we haven't been given both sides of the story. The reality of animal farming is hidden from us, or disguised by marketing labels and industry PR. Ironically, while the animal farming industries hide the reality of how animal products are produced behind labels, they also disregard the other side of the story as simply being vegan propaganda. This catch-all phrase is used to discredit anything that challenges them, no matter how strong the evidence or solid the moral argument. I have written this book to offer this other side, supported by scientific studies, which are all referenced in case you want to find out more. I hope that it will equip you, the reader, with the knowledge to make informed decisions about your own actions, and that it will make you feel empowered, because we all have a say in influencing what the future will look like. It is the amalgamation of 6 years of research, reading, and conversations that I have had with people from every part of the spectrum, from slaughterhouse workers and farmers to animal rights philosophers, environmentalists, and everyday consumers. It has been a journey that has so far involved me debating veganism on live television in front of millions of people, giving hundreds of speeches and lectures, and visiting farms and slaughterhouses around the world. However, this book goes beyond just making the case for veganism, and explores the psychological and social mechanisms behind why we do what we do, highlighting and exposing the societal and cultural constructs that create passive complicity in industries that, on deeper evaluation, contradict the fundamental values that we live by. In essence, this book discusses a myriad of ideas and themes in the hope of empowering vegans to feel more educated and confident in discussing why they are vegan, while at the same time being a comprehensive resource for those looking to learn more about veganism. I hope this prompts questions and highlights information that can, in turn, act as catalysts for self-reflection that ultimately leads to us challenging our own habits, unconscious or otherwise. Some of the information and topics I cover in this book make for uncomfortable reading. Realizing the scale of mass suffering and death that is relentlessly occurring every second of the day is by far the hardest aspect to face. To put it into perspective, it is estimated that globally around 220 million land animals are killed for food every day. And when you factor in marine animals, that number increases to somewhere between 2.4 and 6.3 billion every single day. That means that somewhere between 28,000 and 73,000 animals are killed every second, a completely incomprehensible number. When we talk about animal exploitation, the scale is absolutely staggering. But it's not just the scale. It's the practices that are carried out on these individuals, each with their own experiences and emotions, all suffering as a result of what we are doing to them. Non-human animals are the oppressed majority, each and every one of them at the mercy of our dominance, intellect, and strength. We have created a form of tyranny over the natural world, pillaging, extracting, using, and destroying as we please. We have placed ourselves above the ecological life support systems that our species depends on for survival, and exploited them for our own short-term benefit, cutting down forests and polluting rivers and oceans. We have destroyed millions of years of evolution in the blink of an eye, quite literally bulldozing our way around this finite planet. For all of our intelligence, we have still failed to grasp the simple reality that we need the planet more than the planet needs us. And as we have killed more and more animals and destroyed more and more of the world, we have become sicker and sicker. While some people die early from having too much, others die from having too little. Preventable chronic diseases and preventable world hunger are growing in tandem. and people are suffering because of our woefully illogical, unfair, and unsustainable food system. Humanity is at a crossroads. We can either continue as we currently are, or set off in a new direction, learning from our previous mistakes and working for the benefit of all life. Aristotle said, "The roots of education are bitter, but the fruit is sweet." Undeniably, the issues of animal exploitation, climate change, and disease are bitter issues to learn about, but the potential benefits of doing so cannot be overstated. It is quite literally a matter of life and death. So, while we may say that ignorance is bliss, in reality, aligning our morals and values with our actions, and in doing so, creating a more peaceful, sustainable, and safe world, is far more blissful than turning a blind eye to the suffering that animals are forced to endure, and the catastrophic damage caused as a consequence. As consumers, we have the right to know what we are paying for, and as active participants in the exploitation of animals, we also have a moral obligation to confront the truth about the choices we make. The reality is that we all have our part to play in overcoming injustice, especially one so ubiquitous, systematic, and universally perpetuated as the oppression of non-human animals. With the continuing industrialization of animal farming and the increasing number of animals being farmed, coupled with the ever-growing existential threat of climate change and future pandemics, it has never been more important to address our current food system and challenge ourselves as individuals and consumers. By doing this, we can then challenge the normalization of our dominion over non-human animals and the natural world that in turn negatively impacts every life on this planet, ours included. Fundamentally, that's what this book is, an attempt to hold up a mirror to the absurdity of what we are doing and reveal the solution that is right there in front of us. Non-vegans often say, "Please, stop trying to force me to be vegan." And although this book is aimed at anyone interested in veganism, including vegans themselves who want to become more knowledgeable and better equipped for conversations with others about veganism, I can imagine that some of you who are reading this book are doing so because you have a particularly vocal family member or friend, someone who is desperate for you to become vegan and has asked you to read it. Truth be told, throughout writing this book, I have always kept the reluctant reader in mind, the skeptic who would need the most convincing. After all, that was the person I used to be. If that is you, then first, thank you for choosing to read this book. But second, at the end of the day, nobody can force anyone to be vegan. When you put this book down, what you choose to buy in a supermarket is entirely up to you. We often joke about the existence of the vegan police, but ultimately a vegan isn't going to jump out of the cow's milk fridge and force the oat milk into your hand. And, even if they did, you could just put it down again. However, it is my wish to offer a perspective that helps you to understand veganism better, that answers the questions that you have often pondered, addresses the justifications that you have often used to defend not being vegan, and ultimately encourages you to pick up the oat milk because you want to. Part 1. It's a question of morality. Chapter 1. Veganism is the moral baseline. Like nearly every vegan I have ever met, I never expected when I was younger that I would one day stop consuming all animal products. In fact, growing up, even the concept of vegetarianism was routinely a joke around the family dinner table. It's always easier to laugh at something you don't understand. With veganism only being spared because we had never heard of it. We would make truly terrible jokes, such as, "What's the best thing about having a vegetarian around for dinner?" There would then be a pause before one of us said, "More meat for us." Although, truth be told, since going vegan I have encountered worse, such as the much used, "How do you know when someone is vegan?" Don't worry, they'll tell you. I know people say that vegans don't have a sense of humor, but let's be honest, we're not often presented with the best material. When I was about 12 years old, I was in an English class, and my teacher asked a question along the lines of, "What do you think about vegetarians?" I rather abruptly thrust my hand in the air, and when called on said, "All vegetarians are pale, weak, and skinny." It was somewhat ironic, as I ate meat every day, and yet I was definitely among the weakest and skinniest in the class. I remember there then being a weirdly ominous silence. I looked at my teacher, expecting to hear, "Well done, Edward, great answer." Instead, I was met with a bemused expression. I turned to look at a girl who was sitting diagonally behind me. She was a vegetarian, and I remember thinking she would validate my answer. After all, she would know better than anyone else the compromises she was making in order to pursue her values. Instead, I was met with a ferocious stare that caused me to feel very confused. It wasn't my intention to be offensive. I had merely stated what I believed to be true. Or, more importantly, what I had been told was true. As children, we are unable to rationalize and understand the dangers of the world. So we accept at face value what we are told by our parents and authority figures. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes complete sense. In prehistoric times, we were told, "Don't eat this berry, avoid this animal, don't touch the fire." And we listened, because trusting our communities was instrumental to our survival. As a child, I too was told not to touch the fire because it would burn me. I was instructed not to talk to strangers as it was dangerous, and I was informed that we need meat for protein. But while pigs, cows, and chickens are food, dogs and cats are pets. When I grew up and realized for myself the risks of touching fire and talking to strangers, the validation of those truths consequently validated everything else I had been told. Protein comes from meat, but only a few species of animals are food, while the others are not. This sort of uncontested trust becomes particularly problematic when it inadvertently perpetuates fallacies and ideas that are now outdated and should be challenged, or leads to the sorts of flawed arguments that I hear people use on a daily basis to justify their consumption of animal products. In that moment in the classroom when I was 12 years old, I was simply regurgitating information that I had been told my entire life. If we stop eating meat, dairy, and eggs, we become weak, emaciated, anemic, and ultimately die. I had failed to question whether or not this was even true, which it isn't. More broadly than that, most of us don't stop to reflect on what we do to animals. We simply carry on doing what we have always done. But by living this way, we fail to consider the most important question we should all ask ourselves. How do we morally justify our exploitation of animals? It's a question of morality. There are so many reasons why veganism is the best choice. However, the fundamental argument, the one that underpins all others, is a question of morality. Is eating animal products right or wrong? Any counter-argument that you might hear needs to address this core point. But what do we mean by right or wrong? Well, moral philosophy is a thorny subject that has engaged some of the world's greatest thinkers, dating back to antiquity. It would be easy to get bogged down in theorizing, but for our purposes, it is sufficient to think about morality in terms of what most people would consider to be the values that we should live by, and that we can all broadly agree on. Respect, kindness, generosity, and so on. One of the core values of most relevance to any argument related to the consumption of animal products is that of cruelty. Is it right or wrong to needlessly inflict pain and suffering on others? Only a deranged sociopath would disagree that being willfully cruel is morally wrong. And although there may be some extreme exceptions to this rule, causing a murderous dictator to suffer so that millions of his subjects might be liberated obviously has utilitarian value and is objectively the right thing to do. These are outliers. Most of us can live by the maxim that we should try to avoid being cruel at all costs. It is in this context of what is right and wrong, according to our core values, that any argument about animal exploitation needs to be judged. After all, veganism is an ethical stance against needless animal exploitation. It's not specifically about diet, although food is the primary reason why we use animals. Veganism is instead a social justice issue that recognizes that non-human animals deserve autonomy, moral consideration, and the recognition that their lives are far more valuable than the reasons we use to justify exploiting them. Although not everyone thinks about animal consumption from this ethical perspective, instead choosing to ignore the question, or framing it in terms of human nature or cultural norms, we can always bring it back to whether it is the right and moral thing to do. Because issues of right and wrong are commonly shadowed by what is legal and illegal, it can be easy to presume that what we do to animals isn't that bad. After all, if it was so obviously wrong, surely it would be illegal. But does legality equal morality? Should something be accepted as ethical simply because it is allowed under the law? We need only look to the past to recognize that legality does not equal morality. After all, apartheid was legal, slavery was legal, the Holocaust was legal, as were other acts of genocide that have taken place throughout history. If we were to subscribe to the belief that legality equals morality, then that would mean each country's legal system determines what is moral. But that is not how we determine what is right and wrong in an ethical sense. The catalyst for change. Everything started to change for me in May 2014, when, at the age of 20, I was browsing through the news on the BBC website and came across a piece about a truck carrying 6,000 chickens that had crashed on the way to a slaughterhouse near Manchester. I clicked on the story and was horrified to read that many of the birds had died immediately on impact, in total around 1,500. However, what disturbed me even more was the fact that thousands of the chickens had survived and were left lying on the side of the road, bleeding out with broken bones, combs, beaks, and wings, mutilated and suffering. It was the first time I had ever found myself empathizing with animals who I'm consumed and thinking about our treatment of them from an ethical point of view. Consequently, I was forced to confront the fact that these animals have the capacity to suffer, something that, although obvious, I had never stopped to consider. It also occurred to me that they therefore had a preference to avoid that feeling of suffering. This led me to empathize not only with the chickens involved in that crash, but also the chickens who were being farmed for me. They too, after all, suffered. Except they were suffering because of the choices that I made. At this point in my life, I was a self-proclaimed KFC addict. In fact, I visited my local KFC, which was only a 10-minute walk away, so often that the workers knew my name and my favorite order. A Zinger box meal towered up. To say that I enjoyed KFC would be an understatement. I absolutely loved it. My bi-weekly trip to KFC not only provided me with a meal, it also formed a huge part of my identity and life at that time. Like most people, I precariously balanced on the tightrope of mocking people who didn't want to hurt animals, while simultaneously professing myself to be an animal lover. Yet, in that moment, reading about the crash, I recognized the absurdity of my balancing act and gave myself an ultimatum. I could either bury my head in the sand, ignoring the feelings of guilt and discomfort that causing suffering to an animal created within me, or live by the new principles that I was beginning to form and change my lifestyle. I opted for the latter. I had realized something important about myself. My values were not in alignment with my actions. I wasn't alone. As a society, we are overwhelmingly against animal cruelty. Most of us think that harming animals is reprehensible. But animals are subjected to violence every single day on farms and in slaughterhouses. So why are we selective in our compassion towards animals? And why are we only outraged by some forms of animal cruelty? Animal farming is animal cruelty. If cruelty is defined as causing unnecessary and intentional physical or mental harm, what we do to animals must constitute acts of cruelty. We cut off their tails, we castrate them, we forcibly impregnate them. We take their babies away from them. We lock them in cages where they can't turn around. We load them into trucks and take them to slaughterhouses where we cut their throats or force them into gas chambers. And these are just the standard legal practices. But perhaps even more insidious than that, we don't just ignore that these acts cause physical and mental harm. We go so far as to call them humane. I often ask people to define what the word humane means to them. Normally, people respond by saying that it's the pursuit of reducing suffering for animals. If this is the case, then even by our subjective definition of the word, the most humane thing we can do for these animals is to not needlessly farm and kill them. This is the only way to extend the reduction of their suffering to its fullest extent. But to work out whether or not what we do is objectively humane, and therefore right or wrong, we need only look at the literal definition of the word: having or showing compassion or benevolence, and apply synonyms for the word humane to the acts we perform on them. Is it benevolent to mutilate piglets or to separate newborn babies from their mothers? Is it kind to selectively breed chickens so that they cannot stand and their organs fail? And most importantly, is it compassionate to exploit and ultimately take the life of an animal who does not need or want to die? By any obvious standard, the answer to all of these questions is no. And regardless of the farming methods used, humane slaughter is an oxymoron, as it is impossible to take an animal's life needlessly and against their will in a compassionate, benevolent, or kind way. There's more on this in Chapter 3. By any objective definition of these words, we would say these actions are not only inhumane, they are also acts of cruelty, which, as a society, as well as individuals, we are against and should therefore oppose and denounce. Yet we do not. We support and defend these industries, even though doing so contradicts our values. People often call vegans extremists, and yet veganism is merely living by the principle that if I am against cruelty, then I will do what I can to avoid perpetuating systems that cause physical and mental harm to animals. It is a clear indictment of how ingrained our state of cognitive dissonance is that we see attempts at moral consistency as signs of extremism. Is it not strange that we call those who kill dogs animal abusers, those who kill pigs normal, and those who kill neither extremists? Is it not odd that someone who smashes a car window to rescue a dog on a hot day is viewed as a hero, but someone who rescues a piglet suffering on a farm is a criminal? The issue is our mentality. The story about the crash involving the chickens encouraged me to reevaluate how I viewed animals and to challenge myself and reflect on my justifications for eating meat. As a result, I became vegetarian. Unfortunately, I was still not aware of what happens to dairy cows and egg-laying hens, nor did I grasp the full extent of how significantly animal exploitation has permeated our society. Truth be told, even as a vegetarian, I thought vegans were too militant and extreme. However, that changed about 7 months after that chicken truck crash, when I watched a documentary called Earthlings. The film uses undercover footage to expose what happens to animals in farms, slaughterhouses, research laboratories, puppy mills, and other facilities where animals are exploited. It is relentlessly graphic and objective in its depiction of what happens to animals. At one point in the documentary, the narrator, Joaquin Phoenix, recites a quote from the 19th century philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson. "You have just dined, and however scrupulously the slaughterhouse is concealed in the graceful distance of miles, there is complicity." I felt angry and frustrated with myself as I acknowledged that even though I was vegetarian, I was still guilty of perpetuating these systems of violence that so utterly disgusted me. The animal products on my plate existed because I paid people, albeit indirectly, to cause suffering to animals. Just because the knife wasn't in my hand, or the blood on my clothes, I was still complicit, just as bloodstained, just as culpable. After the film had finished, I went and sat with my pet hamster, Rupert. He was my first real animal companion, aside from Batman, a black goldfish I had as a child, and the first animal I had ever formed a deep connection with. He was wonderful and brought such joy to my life. He was unbelievably cute, and I would often give him treats just so I could sit and watch as he grasped the food with his tiny paws and proceeded to nibble his way through whatever snack I had given him. So, to cheer myself up, I got him a small piece of broccoli, his favorite, and let him sit in my hands while he ate it. As I watched him, I thought back to a part of the documentary in which a guinea pig is being held up by a worker who is also injecting the helpless animal with some sort of undisclosed chemical. The clip is not as disturbing as the majority of the scenes shown, many of which are exceptionally brutal. However, the similarities between Rupert and the guinea pig caused me to think of Rupert being experimented on, and the fear in the guinea pig's eyes reminded me of the fear I had on occasion seen in Rupert's eyes. One time, when he had been running around on the sofa, he had peered too far over the edge and fallen off, landing awkwardly on one of his legs. He'd let out a shrill noise and begun to limp around frantically. He'd looked so scared and confused. I thought about Rupert's distress and how an animal's capacity to feel pain is much the same as my own. I also thought about his personality and the fact that he had likes and dislikes. For instance, he loved the broccoli he was eating right at that moment, but he didn't really like kale. He was also an exceptionally lazy hamster, reluctant to apply himself to anything that required significant physical exertion. He wasn't keen on his running wheel, so I'd got him a running ball instead. But every time I placed him in it, he would walk around for a few minutes and then stop and take out the food he had been storing in his cheeks and eat that instead. Once he had finished eating, he would then proceed to curl up and go to sleep. In the end, I gave him free rein of the room, taking him out of his home and placing him on the floor so he could potter about and do as he pleased. As I continued to watch Rupert eat his piece of broccoli, I thought about all the animals who were exploited on my behalf, but who had personalities just like Rupert, who had likes and dislikes, and who experienced fear and pain, joy and happiness. The ability of animals to have these subjective experiences was outlined in the European Union's 2007 Treaty of Lisbon, which determines that animals are sentient beings. In 2021, the UK government also announced a law that would formally recognise the sentience of animals, including farmed animals. But even outside of these declarations, animals have been documented as showing emotions, including empathy, such as in a study where a rat was placed in water and another rat had the option to either pull a lever that saved the one in the water or pull a lever that released a chocolate treat. The rats pulled the lever to save the rat in distress, even though it meant foregoing the treat. When there was no other rat to save, they would just go for the lever that gave them the treat. Interestingly, if the rat with the choice of levers had been placed in the water previously and had gone through that experience, they were quicker to help the rat they had the chance to save. This study showed that rats display pro-social behavior and exhibit empathy, even in situations where doing so comes at a disadvantage to them. There was also a study carried out in which researchers housed 16 groups of 6 pigs. 2 of the pigs from each group were taken to be trained, with one thinking that something good would happen when a piece of music was played, and the other that something bad was going to happen. They then placed one of the trained pigs back into the pen with the pigs that didn't have any association with the music. The researchers found that the untrained pigs would show emotional contagion, reacting to the behavior of the pig who was expecting something bad to happen by exhibiting signs of stress. While the findings of these studies may shed light on the complexity of non-human animals, the studies themselves are undeniably cruel. By referencing them, I am not condoning the studies, which were undertaken to satisfy human curiosity, not to help animals. After all, rats and pigs shouldn't need to display empathy to warrant not being needlessly exploited. Although, sadly, even the fact that they do hasn't made a difference anyway. It is ironic that we often believe that empathy and complex emotions only really exist in humans, but we then fail to empathize with the animals who suffer at our hands. Primatologist Frans de Waal refers to the denial of these emotions and capabilities in non-human animals as anthropodenial, a term he coined to describe the behavior of discounting the complexity of other animals. As he states, anyone who wants to make the case that a tickled ape who almost chokes on his hoarse giggles must be in a different state of mind from a tickled child has his work cut out for him. But this denial of an animal's intelligence is one of the main defenses we have to justify what we do to them, as studies have shown that people find it more morally wrong to eat animals who are characterized as being mindful, with there being a strong negative correlation between people's perceived intelligence of an animal and the animal's edibility. By believing that humans are exceptional, it's easier for us to deny the animality of humans, but also the humanity of non-human animals. And if we were to challenge the idea of what we classify as being human-only traits, it would fundamentally challenge the way we treat and interact with other animals. And so, as I watched Rupert eating, I thought of all the other animals incarcerated in farms, cages, and slaughterhouses. Their autonomy denied to them, their bodies reduced to nothing other than commodities. Objects whose personalities we disregard and whose lives we treat with such contempt. I thought of someone trying to hurt Rupert and how that would make me feel. What right did I have to inflict pain and suffering on other living beings, especially ones with the characteristics and traits that I held in such high regard where Rupert was concerned? I then considered how I had bought Rupert for £10. This was the value that his existence had been assigned. Such a small sum. By purchasing Rupert, I had treated him as a commodity, and yet, in my eyes, he wasn't an object over which an exchange of money could constitute ownership. But if Rupert wasn't a commodity, then why should any other animal be? Why should any other animal have their autonomy denied them? It was at this point that I realized being vegetarian wasn't enough. I saw that the issue of animal exploitation far transcends the purchasing of meat, and is instead fundamentally an issue of how we view our relationship with other sentient life. Consumption is only a symptom. The real problem is our mentality, a mentality that judges some lives to be less important because of the pleasure we get from consuming their flesh or wearing their skin. We have allowed our physical and intellectual capabilities to make us tyrants over every other species on this planet. I have heard it said before that to the animals we are the devils of this planet, and this world is their hell, a place of subjugation and pain. I can't see any rational reason why this isn't the case. I have to take a break for just a minute because I have to do something in my house. The moral difference between a broccoli stalk and a pig's throat. Those who argue in favor of eating animals will often say that because animals are less intelligent, lack the cognitive capabilities of humans, and are unable to display the same level of agency and responsibility or engage in social contracts, it is therefore morally acceptable to exploit them. However, do we actually believe that intelligence should define worth of life, or that being more intelligent than someone else gives you the right to harm and exploit them? Disturbingly, this line of thinking could also then be used to justify harming human infants and those who are cognitively impaired, because they also lack these abilities. Thankfully, not only do we think such people deserve moral consideration, we often give them special consideration because of their lower cognition and agency. The fact that we simultaneously justify giving animals less consideration for the same reasons is yet another example of how inconsistently we apply our moral framework. Even if we truly lived by the philosophy that intelligence defines worth of life, we wouldn't farm the animals that we do. For example, pigs have been shown to be at least as intelligent as dogs, if not more so. Yet we love one species, welcoming them into our homes, giving them names, and feeling grief when they die, while we staple numbered tags through the ears of the other, treating them as objects and then paying for and disregarding their deaths. Many people even go so far as to mock those who mourn the deaths of farm animals. One species we turn into ashes so we can remember and cherish their life. The other we turn into feces. Besides, if we truly did believe that intelligence defines worth of life, we would all be vegans, as the plants we consume are quantifiably less intelligent than the animals we eat. That being said, some people make the claim that eating plants is morally the same as eating animals, as both are living organisms. However, while plants are alive and capable of doing some amazing things, their intelligence does not equal sentience, nor does it mean that they have subjective experiences and can feel pain. A plant lacks a central nervous system, a brain, and pain receptors. So, while animals respond to situations, plants instead react. This is why a Venus flytrap does not just close around flies, but will close around anything that triggers the pressure stimuli on its trap. Animals, on the other hand, consciously respond to the situations they are in, which is why they won't just eat something because you try to feed it to them. And besides, because of the feed used for animals and the fact that animal suffering is the #1 cause of rainforest deforestation and habitat loss, more plants are killed in the production of non-vegan foods than they are vegan foods. So, even if we did believe that plants suffer, or that they deserve moral consideration due to being alive, we would still be morally obliged to be vegan anyway. Ultimately, people who say that it's hypocritical to eat plants but not animals are trying to convince themselves that there is no discernible moral difference between chopping a broccoli stalk and cutting a pig's throat. Are our taste buds worth more than their lives? With the scale and severity of the violence we perpetuate against animals, you might presume our reason for doing so must be predicated on some deeply regrettable yet intrinsically necessary act for our own survival. Yet, once we have recognized that we don't need to consume animal products to be healthy, the primary reason for why we continue to do so is because we like eating them. We enjoy the taste of steak, bacon, and cheese, and that fact alone is arguably the most persuasive explanation for our treatment of animals. Even if many of us don't realize it, by placing taste at the heart of our justification for eating animal products, we are essentially saying that our pleasure is more important than any moral consideration. I can think of many situations in which an oppressor feels sensory pleasure at the expense of a victim, but those actions are in no way made more acceptable simply because of this. So why would the fact that we enjoy the taste of these products make what we do to animals justified as a result? I think it is unlikely that any of us actually believe that sensory pleasure should be held up as a standard by which our actions are judged to be moral. This would be the equivalent of arguing that our taste buds are worth more than the life and subjective experiences of a sentient being. But the reality is that when we eat any of these products, including dairy and eggs, an animal has either already been killed to produce it, or is in the process of being exploited and will eventually be killed. And there is no moral justification that would make this prioritization of taste over life acceptable. The fact that our enjoyment of these products only lasts for 15 minutes or so, the length of time it takes us to eat a meal, only further trivializes the idea of sensory pleasure being a moral justifier. It's unconscionable that billions of sentient beings have their lives filled with suffering and forcibly taken from them just for fleeting moments of pleasure. Lives obliterated for meals we eat and then forget about. This argument becomes even more unreasonable when we consider that there are already so many great plant-based substitutes and foods available, including burgers, sausages, ice cream, milk, chocolate, and even cheese. Yes, there are good vegan ones, I promise. For nearly every animal product we previously enjoyed, we don't even have to give up the taste, because there is an ever-growing range of delicious alternatives available. It's not our differences that matter. At the center of the moral justifications we use to defend animal consumption is the notion of speciesism, a term coined in 1970 by Richard Ryder, an ex-vivisectionist turned animal rights advocate. The term was then popularized in 1975 by the philosopher Peter Singer in his book Animal Liberation. Singer defines speciesism as being a prejudice or attitude of bias in favor of the interests of members of one's own species and against those of members of other species. In other words, a prejudice that says it's okay to favor a human's desire to eat a bacon sandwich over a pig's desire to not be killed in a gas chamber. Favoring one's own species in a situation where you had to choose between saving a member of your own species or a different one, for example, choosing to save a human child over a dog from a fire, could, of course, be morally justified. But this doesn't justify speciesism, or arbitrarily causing harm to non-human animals. In the same way, faced with an unavoidable decision between allowing a young child or a 95-year-old human to live, favoring the child in this circumstance does not justify ageism or allowing the elderly to suffer or die needlessly. One of the main issues with a speciesist mentality is that it creates arbitrary distinctions between different species of animals, such as between dogs and pigs. Even more importantly, it creates a mindset of discrimination that in turn can facilitate exploitation. It carries the idea of human superiority to the extreme, to the point that trivial and needless human desires are morally permissible, such as skinning animals for a fur or leather jacket, forcing animals into slaughterhouses for a sandwich, or separating newborn calves from their mothers so that we can drink their mother's milk. It is important to note that anti-speciesists recognize that humans and non-humans are vastly different in many ways, including our physical forms, intelligence, and sociability, among other things. However, it is not the differences that are relevant when deciding whether non-humans matter morally, but instead the similarities. Most fundamentally, sentience, meaning the capacity to feel and experience subjectively. If it is sentience that makes human animals worthy of moral consideration, then it is sentience that makes non-human animals worthy of moral consideration too. Even if we were to believe that there is a moral distinction between a human and a non-human, that distinction is surely not so significant that it justifies the unnecessary torture and slaughter of hundreds of billions of animals every single year. In fact, any amount of moral value should prohibit the act of slaughter, and the objective reality that animals can suffer and have subjective experiences immediately withdraws any notion of acceptability when it comes to exploiting them. However, speciesism is so ingrained and normalized within society that we don't even consider it a problem. Many humans view non-human animals with such little regard that the very concept of animals deserving moral consideration is seen as offensive, as they believe that recognizing that other animals also deserve basic rights is somehow demeaning to our own species. People will often laugh at those who raise these issues, but of course it's much easier to mock the idea of animals having basic rights than it is to look at a piece of steak on a dinner plate and attempt to justify why animals have such little worth that they should have their throats cut simply because we enjoy eating a piece of their body. Ultimately, it's important for us to recognize that we have moral agency and are able to rationalize and scrutinize our decisions. Instead of killing animals being a prerequisite for survival, as is the case for certain species of wild animals, we can and should hold ourselves accountable when making decisions that pertain to what is right and wrong. Some people believe that to be vegan means you have to be an animal lover or be someone who goes out of their way to be kind to animals. But it's not an act of kindness to not needlessly hurt someone. If we walk down the street and don't kick a dog, that's not an act of kindness. In the same way, avoiding forcing animals into gas chambers and macerators and onto kill lines isn't an act of benevolence. It's an act of justice and respect for the basic moral consideration that all animals deserve. Alright, that's the end of chapter 1, and so we can discuss it, and I'm going to go into voice chat 1. Hello? Hello?
Good job, Jordan. Can't wait to hear chapter 2.
Thanks. So we're doing chapter 2 this session as well. I don't know if I mentioned that or made that clear, but yeah, we're just discussing this for a while. I'll rest my voice a bit, and then we'll do chapter 2. Try and finish this book quickly.
That's awesome. I'm enjoying the book. I wanted to buy it, but didn't have the money for it, so I was like, oh well. This is almost better.
Yeah, I've been recording this, and so I might upload it. It depends. Apparently, Ed enforces copyright, so I don't know how that works. I might have it unlisted or something like that. I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so what did you think?
I like it.
Yeah. Until I read this book, my favorite is like a general overview, and also something I could hand to a carnist was Why We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs, and Wear Cows by Melanie Joy. This is just as good. I think they have slightly different approaches, but that's fine. I'm actually working on a summary of Animal Liberation by Peter Singer. And so, yeah, once that's done, if people are interested in what he's had to say about this kind of stuff, then they can get that. I think so I don't know if people have seen the contents. I might take a screenshot of it and post it in the book club in that channel. But so part 1 is about morality. Part 2 is about the planet, public health and personal health. And then part 3 is about like psychology, social influences and conversations and stuff. The next chapter is on the history of animal farming. I don't think that chapter's super necessary, but chapter 3 is very important, which is there's no such thing as a happy farm animal, where he goes over like all of the major kinds of animal farming.
I like that.
Sorry? Sorry, what did you say?
Oh, I'm not really saying anything. Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah, so chapter 3 goes over how exactly each industry, each sector of production harms animals. So that's really useful as well. I think so what he's done is, I think this is called like the basic argument for vegetarianism, which is that you shouldn't cause suffering unless you have a good reason. I think James Rachel's presented this argument in an ethics paper. It's like a condensed interpretation of Singer. Yeah, so it focuses on suffering and the absence of a compelling reason to do it, right? And the goal of making the argument this way is to make it as uncontroversial as possible, you don't want to invoke any principles or arguments where people don't accept the premises, they don't accept what you're starting with. So if you can find starting points that pretty much everyone agrees with, then they're more likely to, go to the conclusion with you, which is nice.
That's the goal, right?
Yeah, a lot of people don't realize that, and it's because it's not
Yeah.
taught. Like an important part of reasoning in general, but persuasion is finding incredibly uncontroversial premises, and you want to try and get to your conclusion in a way that doesn't start with anything controversial. That's the only way you can really persuade people. Because otherwise, if you start off with the principle that you have to give animals exactly as much consideration as humans, a lot of people will just leave you there and they don't care where you take that, right? We're making pretty good time though. So we've done 26 pages, and the next chapter is 20. So we can probably get this done by the hour. Alright, I'll go back to the stage and get started on chapter 2, if everyone's happy with that.
I don't think anyone here is gonna say anything in contrary.
Yeah, that's okay. Alright, I'll pop back in.
Okie doke.
Starting chapter 2. Alright. So chapter 2 is our past shows us why veganism must be our future. So purpose of this chapter is showing how animal farming has also been harmful in the past and how it got to the point where it is now. So how exactly did factory farming come about? Stuff like that. All right. 2. Our past shows us why veganism must be our future. When I have conversations with people about veganism, they often say, I agree with you, which is why I try to buy meat from small local family farms when I can. However, the idea that a farm being nearby means that it's more ethical clearly doesn't hold up when you consider that every farm is local to someone. Plus, 98% of farms in the USA are classified as family farms, which makes you realize that the notion of a family farm has nothing to do with an animal's well-being, but is instead a marketing ploy to make us think of a romanticized ideal of farming that simply doesn't exist. However, I used to have this attitude too. One of the biggest misconceptions about veganism is that it exists to oppose factory farming, and that the moral concerns around eating animal products are purely focused on these intensive practices. This is one way in which we can avoid dealing with the morality of animal consumption. We perceive factory farming to be the problem, not the mindset that has allowed factory farming to exist in the first place. But by looking at our past, we can see that factory farming was not the beginning of the problem, and why our future needs to be progressive and not regressive. So, how did we get to where we are today? We often romanticize the history of animal farming and talk about a return to idyllic days gone by. However, while this perception acknowledges how destructive and cruel animal farming has become, it unfortunately overlooks the fact that it has never been idyllic, or indeed humane. In fact, our history of animal exploitation is fraught with examples of why idealizing the past won't help us to address the fundamental problems with farming today. It is also indicative of the deep misconceptions people have when it comes to the mass production of animals for human consumption. Perception versus reality. I am always amazed by how many people, when asked, say that they are opposed to the mistreatment of animals. For example, a poll conducted in the USA in 2017 showed that 49% of Americans agreed with the statement, "I support a ban on the factory farming of animals," with 47% even supporting a ban on slaughterhouses. What's even more striking, though, is that 58% of people also believed that farmed animals are treated well. This ultimately shows how disconnected we are from the process of what happens to animals and how uninformed we are. 50% of respondents were against a method of farming that produces more than 99% of the animal products in the USA, according to government census data. Yet the majority of people also simultaneously believed that farmed animals are treated well. There's a clear contradiction between what consumers want, what they are actually buying, and what they think they are buying. So how is it that an industry that half of the population wants banned is not only the most dominant system of animal product production, but also goes almost entirely unopposed and is even perpetuated by the people who say they are against it? In politics, there is a concept called the Overton window, which is sometimes referred to as the window of discourse. It is defined as the range of ideas that the general public is willing to consider and may accept at any given time. So, from a politician's perspective, it contains the policies that the majority of voters see as reasonable and legitimate. The window will shift over time, both for better and worse, due to social factors and changing perceptions. Campaigners seek to actively move it by persuading people of the value of ideas that they may have first found extreme. For example, women's right to vote was once an extreme concept to many that ultimately became a social norm. This idea of an ever-shifting window of what we perceive as acceptable can be applied to the evolution of animal exploitation as well, as the system and the scale of what we have today came about through incremental changes over a long period of time. Unfortunately, these changes have been defined by increasing industrialization and aspirations for further efficiency and profitability. We have made farms more intensive, confining more animals in smaller spaces, while also breeding them to grow bigger, faster. If we look at factory farming in particular, the advent of industrialized animal farming started in the 1920s, but became increasingly significant from the 1960s onwards, and we have seen the scale continue to increase ever since. However, to understand how we have created the system of agriculture that we have today, we need to go way back to the time before we even had an agricultural system at all. 1 sec, I'm going to have a drink. From humble beginnings. Early humans were nomadic beings who relied on hunting and gathering for survival. In practice, this means that for most of our history, we were opportunistic scavengers who primarily ate plants, insects, some small animals, and carrion. In fact, it is believed that early humans may have often resorted to eating bone marrow from bigger animals, as we were unable to compete with larger, stronger predators, and had to consequently wait for them to finish eating the animals that they had killed. By the time it was our turn, there wouldn't be anything particularly substantial left, except, of course, the bones, from which we could then extract the marrow. As a result, for most of our existence, humans were very much in the middle of the food chain, able to hunt smaller animals, but still at the mercy of predators. Despite animals making up only a portion of the prehistoric diet, people who are anti-vegan often argue that our brains developed as a consequence of us hunting and eating meat. However, we don't know for certain why our brains began to develop and grow in the way that they did, and there are other theories as well. For example, that the consumption of foods such as potatoes was actually responsible for the growth of our brains. In many ways, this appears to make more sense. Because our brains use around 20 to 25% of all our energy, and because the body's main source of energy is glucose, consuming foods high in carbohydrates would have been highly beneficial for our cognitive development. The argument becomes even more compelling when you consider that the use of fire is often believed to have contributed to our brains growing bigger. Fire allowed us to cook foods that would have previously been hard to digest, such as wild grains and tubers, which became staples in our diet and are some of the most carbohydrate-dense foods on the planet. This theory was further supported by a study published in 2021 that was carried out by an international research team. The researchers analyzed the fossilized dental plaque of early humans and found oral bacteria specifically adapted to break down starch, which would have only existed if starch was a regular part of their diet. Of course, it is true that the cooking of food aided the consumption of meat as well, making it safer and easier to digest. But even if we believe that eating meat did contribute to Homo sapiens' cognitive revolution, the name often given to the period when our brains developed, it would still be illogical to attempt to justify the consumption of animals for this reason, especially as we can hardly make the argument that eating cooked meat is now making us a more intelligent society. Whatever happened tens of thousands of years ago, however significant it was, should have no bearing on determining whether or not what we do to animals is justified now. As a consequence of the cognitive revolution, we began to colonize the world. Starting in Africa, where Homo sapiens originated from, we migrated to different parts of the planet, where unfortunately a pattern emerged: the demise of the world's megafauna. We colonized Australia, where we encountered animals such as flightless birds twice the size of ostriches, marsupial lions, giant koalas, and diprotodons, huge wombats weighing around 2.5 tons. Unfortunately, Out of the 24 Australian animal species that weighed more than 50 kilograms, 23 became extinct. It was a similar story when the first Homo sapiens made it to the Americas, traveling from Alaska into Canada, and then the USA, where we encountered mammoths, saber-toothed cats, 6-meter-high giant ground sloths, and huge rodents the size of bears, before heading into Central and South America, where we came across all kinds of reptiles and birds. Sadly, 50 out of the 60 genera of large animals that existed in South America went extinct, as did 34 out of the 47 genera in North America. These were species and genera that had existed for tens of millions of years, surviving changing climates, but they were no match for humans, who wiped out hundreds of millions of years worth of evolution. The dawn of agriculture. During this time of colonization, we entered the Neolithic period, which started around 12,000 years ago. It was at this time that we discovered we could grow some plants from seeds and domesticate certain species of animals. Consequently, we started what has come to be known as the Agricultural Revolution. Agriculture first began in the Fertile Crescent, an area of land that spans the Middle East and includes modern-day Iraq, Syria, and Egypt, among others. It was highly fertile due to irrigation from the large rivers in the region and the diverse climate. As a result of agriculture, we stopped being nomadic beings and began to live more sedentary and settled lives. Our population also began to grow considerably. There were only an estimated 4 million humans on the planet 12,000 years ago. Agriculture has allowed for the global population to reach almost 8 billion people and counting. It was during the Agricultural Revolution that the animals we now farm by the billion were first domesticated, and we began to use them for their meat, secretions, skin, and labor. This process required animals to be turned into subjugated beings, with their desires and natural instincts removed as much as possible. As a result, animals were whipped, bridled, leashed, and mutilated, with male animals often being castrated if they weren't being used for breeding. Many of these practices that were carried out on animals thousands of years ago are still routine today. Take dairy production, for example. Throughout history, farmers have killed male calves shortly after their birth, as is still commonplace in many dairy farms today. Ancient farmers would alternatively tie rings of thorns around the mouths of calves so that it hurt their mothers if they tried to suckle. Farmers around the world currently use devices that are designed to perform the same purpose. Other farmers would kill the offspring, eat them, and then stuff the skin, smearing it with the mother's urine to trick her into producing more milk that humans could then consume. Disturbingly, this practice can still be seen today, with some farmers stuffing dead calves with hay to try to trick mother cows into producing more milk. A similar practice is known as grafting, whereby a farmer skins a dead calf and places it over the body of another calf to trick the mother of the dead animal into thinking that the other baby is her own. Many of us believe that farming only became cruel when we started factory farming in the 20th century. However, it is clear that as soon as we started to farm animals, we began to abuse them. with many of the practices we now find abhorrent having existed since the domestication of animals began. It was our ancestors who started us on the road to the animal agriculture industries of the 20th and 21st centuries. In many ways, the fact that animal farming has such violent origins makes it easier to understand how farmers were able to keep pushing the boundaries of what would be considered acceptable, shifting bit by bit the Overton window of animal farming. The chicken of tomorrow. The Industrial Revolution in the 18th and 19th centuries facilitated the next significant progression in our agriculture development, especially in relation to selective breeding. The practice of selectively choosing to breed specific animals together based on them having desirable traits is a manufactured version of natural selection. However, instead of animals evolving for reasons advantageous to them, animals are changed by humans for reasons advantageous to us. Selective breeding has been around for thousands of years, particularly in the case of dogs. However, the Industrial Revolution saw it becoming established as a scientific practice and led to breeding programs for sheep who were bred to grow larger quantities of wool, and for cattle who were bred to grow larger in size and be more profitable for cattle farmers. In the case of sheep, because farmers found that those that shed the least amount of wool to be the most desirable and easiest to profit from, over time they continued to selectively breed the animals to a point that they no longer naturally shed their wool, as they had done for millennia. This is why sheep now have to be sheared. Other animals that have been selectively bred include dairy cows, who produce significantly more milk than their offspring would have drunk. Pigs, who have been selectively bred to grow larger, and egg-laying hens, who can now produce up to 300 eggs a year, which is significantly higher than the 10 to 15 eggs their presumed wild ancestor, the red jungle fowl, lays. Chickens raised for their meat, referred to as broiler chickens, have also been selectively bred. In fact, in the late 1940s, there was a United States Department of Agriculture, USDA, organized Chicken of Tomorrow contest, the purpose of which was to breed a chicken with larger breasts and legs that would make chicken meat more cost-effective and desirable for consumers. After the winner of the contest was announced, there was even a celebratory parade with floats depicting the poultry industry, which rather bizarrely included a woman who had been crowned the festival Broiler Queen, perched on top of a car waving. Is there not something very odd about the idea of crowning someone Queen of Broiler Chickens? For the chickens, the contest was anything but a cause for celebration. It was the start of a significant increase in the number of them who would be made to suffer and then be killed. The selective breeding of broilers continued to the point that they are today bred to reach slaughter age in only 6 weeks, a rate of growth 300% faster than in 1960. In that time, they reach a weight 4 times heavier on average than chickens raised in 1957. Chickens have suffered hugely as a consequence of this selective breeding, with many of them dying from organ failure, suffering from immune system problems, and being unable to move due to their excessive weight, meaning they are unable to reach food and water points. We often make appeals to nature to justify our consumption of animals. But even if we believe that eating animals is a natural part of being human, and overlook the point that what is natural is not always what is best, morally or otherwise. What we do to animals is about as far removed from nature as is possible. It is a wholly industrialized process that involves selective breeding, artificial insemination, and mutilations, to name but a few of the terrible practices that happen every day. It treats animals as if they are simply replaceable objects, commodities who have no value beyond the price tag on the supermarket shelf. The dirty milk crisis. As well as selective breeding, the Industrial Revolution also saw a huge rise in milk and dairy consumption. Although milk had been consumed for thousands of years, in rural communities it was a localized cottage industry with a dairy farm supplying the immediate community. However, during this period of time, people began leaving their subsistence farms for large towns and cities, creating an opportunity for the dairy industry to become increasingly professionalized. This urbanization also meant that milk now had to travel greater distances to reach people, which posed a specific problem for dairy farmers. Dry foods and grains could be transported easily, and even meat could be dried or salted. But at the time, there was no way of preserving milk in its raw form. Milk is an ideal environment for bacteria, making things even more difficult for the dairy industry. Diseases, such as bovine tuberculosis, could contaminate milk, killing many people, particularly children. In Britain alone, an estimated 500,000 infant deaths between 1850 and 1950 were caused by tuberculosis-infected milk, and as many as 30% of all tuberculosis deaths before 1930 are thought to have originated from milk. There was also the risk of milk being contaminated with scarlet fever, diphtheria, and typhoid. In fact, it got so bad in the 1850s, a New York journalist demanded to know why the police weren't investigating dairy farmers, as milk was so risky to consume. By the 1880s, analyses of milk samples in New Jersey found liquefying colonies of bacteria to be so high in number that they were unable to count them. These problems were compounded even further during the summer months, when milk would go off much quicker. As a result, a common gastrointestinal condition, referred to as summer complaint due to it appearing in the warmer months, is strongly believed to have come from milk. There were other issues plaguing the dairy industry at that time, including a distrust of dairy farmers that had built up due to the multitude of substances they were adding to their products. For example, in an attempt to make more money, dairy producers would thin their milk by adding water and then using chalk, plaster dust, or dyes to recolor the liquid. An article published in the Indianapolis News in 1900 reported that a family discovered a pint of milk that they had bought was wriggling due to the fact that there were worms inside the stagnant water that the farmer had used to thin it. It was also reported that farmers were adding a layer of pureed calf brains to milk to give it the appearance of having a rich cream. More disturbing still, without refrigeration or effective preserving methods, farmers began to add formaldehyde to their milk. This was done as a reaction to how contaminated it was, as it was believed the chemical could help kill the bacteria. By the 1890s, formaldehyde use had become so widespread that the terms embalmed milk and embalmed meat were used to describe the practice. As you might expect, the preservative made people sick. In 1899 alone, 400 children died in Indiana after drinking embalmed milk. Thankfully, dairy producers began to be prosecuted for using formaldehyde. The practice was banned in the USA in 1906, while in the UK, formaldehyde was legal for use in milk up until 1912. As was borax, a compound that is used in cleaning products to get rid of mold and mildew. The dirty milk crisis was so serious that increasing milk sanitation is viewed as one of the main reasons why infant mortality in the USA dropped so significantly in the early 20th century. However, during the dirty milk crisis, despite the risks, the product was increasingly being marketed as an important food for children. Medical professionals worried that the urbanization of families could place a strain on mothers and jeopardize the quality of their breast milk, or even lead to them not being able to produce any at all. This encouragement to drink cow's milk proved not only to be incredibly dangerous for infants, who were being exposed to bacteria and chemicals from the milk, but it was also significant in shaping our perceived idea that cow's milk is important for children. One sec. I'm glad that I've only got a few pages left because my voice is getting tired. The underground cheese bunkers. Alongside pasteurization, which became widespread in the 1920s, the turmoil of the early 20th century also changed our relationship with milk forever. During the First World War, governments sent powdered and tinned milk overseas for the Allied troops. Due to this, significantly higher quantities of milk needed to be produced, and many farmers consequently began to grow their dairy herds, breeding more animals into existence, or turning their diversified farms into solely dairy farms. After the war ended, the demand for dairy products dropped dramatically, but the supply of milk remained just as high. This led to low prices, and dairy farmers unionizing to demand a higher price for their milk. However, instead of encouraging a reduction in the production of milk, the government worked to increase the amount being consumed by perpetuating the idea that milk is important and necessary for human health and development. This included federally subsidized milk advertising and the introduction of school milk programs, as well as USDA guidance that children should be consuming 4 glasses of milk a day. When the Second World War started, a similar supply chain was set up to provide troops with long-life dairy products. Once again, there was a drop-off in demand after the war had ended. This led to the US government creating a buyback scheme called the Milk Price Support Program, in which they would purchase surplus storable dairy products, such as butter and cheese, from farmers. This scheme did nothing to address the oversupply of dairy products, and instead encouraged it, as farmers knew they would get a constant price for the dairy they produced. The problem became so prevalent that the US government began to store the huge surplus of dairy products in vast warehouses, having spent billions of dollars of taxpayers' money to buy them from the producers in the first place. This eventually led to the creation of so-called government cheese. Under pressure due to the billions of dollars the government was spending, in 1981, Ronald Reagan began to give some of the surplus processed cheese to people in need. To this day, the US government still buys back dairy products, with the USDA purchasing $50 million of surplus milk in 2018. There is so much surplus cheese being stored by the US government that it is estimated it would be as big as the US Capitol building if it was formed into one giant wheel. Even more alarming, it is estimated that between 2017 and 2018, the amount of surplus cheese grew by 6%, while at the same time, per capita milk consumption declined, suggesting that instead of adapting to the changing market, the industry is instead continuing to rely on the taxpayer to subsidize the difference. It was a similar story in the EU as well, with the Common Agricultural Policy, set up during the second half of the 20th century, guaranteeing farmers a minimum price for what they produced, no matter how much they produced. The policy was created to increase Europe's food sufficiency and security following the Second World War, as well as providing a stable income for those working in agriculture. However, it also created huge agricultural surpluses, leading to the creation of so-called butter and beef mountains and milk lakes. It is bad enough that production of dairy involves so much exploitation and suffering for animals, but there is something inherently wrong with a system that uses taxpayer funds to knowingly and needlessly overproduce, resulting in masses of milk and other dairy products that will never even be consumed. Undermining the miracles of modern medicine. The biggest catalyst in the creation of modern-day farming has been the significant scientific and technological breakthroughs that have occurred since the Industrial Revolution. One of the most notable of these was the discovery of penicillin by Alexander Fleming in 1928, which led to the introduction of antibiotics, often referred to as the miracle of modern medicine. For the first time, common, life-threatening infections could be treated, and illnesses that were previously lethal became not only manageable, but of little concern. The same was also true for illnesses that affected farm animals. The other most significant breakthrough came from Louis Pasteur, who initially developed vaccines for anthrax and chicken cholera in the late 19th century. In the 20th century, we eradicated smallpox and greatly reduced the prevalence of polio, measles, diphtheria, and tetanus, among others, through the use of vaccination. Vaccination also began to be extensively used on farm animals to protect them from diseases such as cattle plague, rotavirus, and infectious bronchitis. The discovery of antibiotics and vaccines came at the same time as a rise in a deeper understanding of animal behavior, alongside increasing awareness of vitamins and animal nutrition. For the first time, we were able to work out exactly what animals needed to survive, and not have to worry about diseases killing them off if they were to be farmed inside in larger numbers, where unhygienic conditions combined with overcrowding would otherwise make farming unviable. Bringing animals inside gave the farmers much more control of the process, allowing them to raise more animals using less space and resources. It also meant they could control the feed, temperature, and lighting, which allowed them to optimize the growth of the animals further. The rise of factory farming. The first animals to be farmed intensively were chickens in the 1920s and 30s, with vitamin D supplementation allowing chicken farmers to raise the animals in confinement all year round, as they no longer needed sunlight to thrive. A more commercially oriented poultry sector emerged alongside the creation of early model battery cages. At this time, chicken meat was mainly seen as a byproduct of the egg industry, meaning that cockerels were viewed as less desirable. Chicken farmers would castrate the male chickens by cutting the testes out of the birds in order to make their breasts bigger and therefore more profitable. The era of factory farming is widely regarded as having started in Britain not long after the Second World War in 1947. It was brought about by the introduction of a new subsidy in the Agriculture Act that incentivized farmers to produce more food, improve breeding, maximize animal management, and incorporate new technology into agriculture. The motivation was to increase the self-sufficiency of food production in the UK and decrease reliance on imported meat. In essence, similar to the Common Agricultural Policy, it was seen as a way of increasing food security in the wake of a world war and food rationing. The end of the Second World War also brought about the rise of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers. Throughout the war, countries had built large-scale nitrate factories to produce bombs, and the industry was simply able to transition these factories into the production of nitrate fertilizers instead. This allowed farmers to produce significantly larger amounts of feed for animals, meaning that not only could more animals be produced, but there was less need for these animals to have access to outside areas, as they no longer needed to forage or graze for food. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, the price of eggs and chicken meat began to plummet, causing smaller scale producers to go bankrupt and be replaced by larger industrial operations, further compounding the problem. In fact, it was estimated that egg prices decreased so significantly in the 1950s that farmers had to triple the number of hens they kept to cover the price of the drop, leading to more hens being housed in confined spaces. Then, in the mid-1960s, following on from the success of the poultry industry, the factory farming of pigs and cattle began, with farmers bringing the animals permanently indoors and relying heavily on antibiotics and feed to maximize their production. It was at this point that animal farming really began to take the shape that we recognize now, with the problem growing substantially into the 1980s, at which point huge meat-producing companies saw massive growth and market domination. Many of these corporations expanded by recruiting small farms and contracting them to breed and produce animals. In this model, the animals are legally owned by the corporations, so the more farms that join, the more animals the companies own. This in turn leads to a higher supply of animals, as the corporations force the farmers to adapt to their more intensive practices and scale up to meet the demands of the contracts, which then cause the prices to drop. This cycle makes it exceptionally difficult for independent farmers to compete with the corporations, and so more and more contract themselves out to the major corporations to survive, further perpetuating the problem. In fact, it is estimated that around 97% of chicken farmers in the USA are currently contractors for these huge corporations. It's a similar story in the UK, with companies such as Moy Park, who have a near monopoly on farmers in Northern Ireland, and Avara Foods contracting smaller farms to supply them with their animals. All of this leads to a lack of competition and a proverbial race to the bottom, where deregulation, a lack of oversight, and a monopolization of the market creates declining standards for the humans and animals exploited within the industry. This move to factory farming, coupled with the fact that consumers, by and large, have become used to being able to buy cheap meat, dairy, and eggs, creates a self-fulfilling cycle that is killing trillions of animals, creating widespread chronic disease, destroying our environment, increasing the risk of pandemics, and wasting trillions of dollars of taxpayers' money in the form of subsidies and bailouts. To emphasize the power these corporations have, we need look no further than JBS, the biggest of all meat packers. As reported by the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, they have an annual turnover of $50 billion and slaughter nearly 14 million animals every single day. They have also been found to have bought meat from a farm that was under investigation by Brazilian prosecutors for using modern-day human slaves. JBS said they stopped as soon as they were aware. They faced allegations of buying cattle from ranchers located on illegally deforested land. They say they plan to work on their supply chains. They defended allegations of insider trading and admitted bribing politicians. Yet, despite all of this, their products can still be found on the shelves of major supermarkets in the USA, Australia, and the UK. The industrialization of farming is not restricted to the West. Since the 1990s, there has been a huge expansion of animal farming across Asia, particularly in China. In 1990, the country was the world's 24th largest producer of milk, but by 2017, it was the 4th biggest, behind only the EU, the USA, and India. Likewise, in the 1980s, beef was known as millionaire's meat in China. However, the country is now one of the biggest producers and consumers of beef. Overall, Chinese citizens are eating 4 times as much meat per year now than they did in the 1980s. Unfortunately, this trend is only going to increase as the industrialization of animal farming continues to grow across not only China, but the rest of Asia as well. An ever-growing population currently means an ever-growing supply of animal products. Even in places such as the UK, where veganism is on the rise, there has been an alarming trend in the increasing number of so-called mega farms. In fact, there was a 26% increase in intensive factory farming in the UK between 2011 and 2017. US-style cattle feedlots, which are essentially confined grassless pens in which cattle are fattened up on grain for slaughter, have begun to be used in the UK as well. A grim future awaits us if we don't change direction. As we look towards the future, as well as the continuing selective breeding of animals and the growth of intensive farming, there have been several other disturbing ideas suggested as potential ways to feed a growing global population. One such idea, put forward during a project to find sustainable solutions to UK animal farming, involved removing the cerebral cortex of chickens and essentially lobotomizing them and hooking them up to life support machines to keep them alive. This really summarizes just how far we have gone in devaluing the lives of non-human animals, to the point where lobotomizing them is viewed as a potential way of making farming more sustainable, rather than no longer eating the animals in the first place. Gene editing is another idea under discussion, with the USDA and the animal agriculture industries looking to control this new technology and find ways to incorporate it into factory farming. This could involve animals' genes being edited so that they are hornless, or, more disturbingly, designing them to be blind or deaf so that they would be less distressed about being in crowded conditions. Unfortunately, our history of animal mistreatment has created the industrial system of animal farming we have today. But instead of looking to our past to justify continuing down the same road, we should instead recognize the process that is going on right before our eyes and stop it now. We should in no way romanticize the farming of our past. While the industrialization of animal agriculture has brought about disastrous consequences, there has never been a point in our farming history when animals were treated well. Small, local, family farms still operate by exploiting animals, and much of what happens to animals today is a result of practices that started long before factory farming existed. The reality is, we have a broken relationship with animals. We have created a mindset that views other animals as subjugated beings who we can freely dominate however we like, consequently leading to us exterminating en masse dozens of genera and species in our pre-agricultural days, and then creating a farming system that has caused such extreme suffering and death. So, as we look to our future, we must look to our past, not because we should return to it, but to show us why we must move forward in a new direction entirely. One that doesn't just involve a different system of agriculture, but that also involves reshaping our relationship with animals in general, and no longer viewing them as simply existing for us to dominate as we please. Alright, that's the end of chapter 2. And for discussion, I'm going to hop in voice chat 1.
That was a great chapter.
Yeah, it was.
It's the best brief history of the animal holocaust that I've seen so far. Disgusting, horrible stuff.
Yeah, it's not something that other things seem to focus on. Um, it it's valuable to be aware of it, I guess. Yeah. I tend to start my analysis with the beginning of factory farming, um, which came about due to advances in nutritional science and stuff. But yeah, I like how he explained that pretty much the laws of economics dictate if you have animal exploitation, you're going to have factory farming. Pretty much, if it's legal, it's going to be all of it's going to become that. Because there is like cutthroat competition because of vertical integration, which is the contracts he was talking about. How corporations have complete control over the whole process. How you save money on land if you put more animals into a smaller space, and you will be out of business if you don't cut costs that could be cut. Yeah, so it is a race to the bottom, and it's pretty universal.
Hmm. A lot of stuff there I haven't heard before. I knew it was pretty bad, but I didn't know that the whole history how we got here.
Yeah. The milk stuff was interesting. I hadn't heard of that before.
Yeah, the
dirty
was
milk.
like the dirty milk history that was really interesting. Didn't know that either. It's really disgusting, man.
Yeah, it is.
So are you gonna read the whole book tonight, or are you gonna divide the in different days or something?
I'm just gonna do 2 hours a session each week.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, so we're
It
finishing.
really feels like it feels like I'm listening to an audiobook, man. You're doing a really great job. You deserve a bigger audience here.
Sorry.
You deserve a bigger audience.
Oh, thank you. Well, I did record it, so hopefully it can be uploaded, and then more people can be interested.
Okay, cool, awesome.
Yeah. But yeah, I think the chapter we just read, I feel like every other chapter in the book is more important than that one, so I'm glad to have it done. Yeah, but it's still interesting,
Yeah, it's just something I haven't heard before. Like I always focus on the ethics of it and stuff like that, but it's good to know the history as well.
Yeah, for the ethic, what have you looked into for the ethics of it?
Just in general, you studying normative ethics and uh animal ethics and stuff like that.
Okay.
Like,
Which like figures and texts have you looked at?
well, what was that?
Which theorists and which texts have you looked at for animal ethics?
I've just heard Peter Singer and a little bit about the Reagan, so the utilitarian and the deontologist side. Yeah. So what about you?
Um, a lot, because like that's my field of study. So I specialize in that stuff. So yeah, Singer and Reagan are I guess the big two. But there's a lot of other ethical theorists that are really good as well.
Well, your field of study is ethics or philosophy?
Yeah.
Hi.
Okay, and what vegan philosophers would you recommend on the ethics?
Michael Hume is pretty good. Also Laurie Gruen. Hello. You sound a bit distant, or there's something that makes.
Yeah.
What's up with your audio?
Hey, how's it going tonight?
Hello.
Good.
We're just discussing
How's yours?
the chapter we just read.
That's awesome. Are you vegan?
Yeah. So, if no one has anything else to say about the chapter, I'm happy to wrap it up here.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.